Hi guys, this is Charles Toefield with Toefieldillustration short stream, episode 1. Here you're just taking a look at an illustration that I did recently for a relaunch of a comic that I was doing a couple of years ago that I entitled Catacomb Champions. So here what you're seeing is an example of one of the panels being illustrated. Just to give you an idea on what's going on, the reason why you're seeing the panel isolated the way that it is because this is going to be put specifically on Instagram, to see if I can generate some attention. A little bit about me. I'm an illustrator outside of the Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia sort of tri-state area. I've been trying to get into illustration for a while now, and this is just an example of sort of the way that I work and my workflow. So that's what's going on here. What you're seeing here is basically me finishing the thumbnails and me going through the inking stage of doing the illustration. I tend to work on panels in waves, or sort of like strafing it. I start off with the thumbnails, then I blow up the thumbnails, and then at that point I begin inking the image, where I start doing a sort of a detailed line drawing based on those thumbnails. And that's before I do, take on the other steps. But this particular panel rather, is showing image of a carriage running through a deep forest. It's a deep forest that's on the edge of territory that's mostly populated by elves and sort of fae-like creatures. Catacomb Champions, it's effectively a dungeon crawler comic. That's what it is. And the idea is that, I get people who are reading the comic to actually participate, because they make the decisions in the comic. I don't. I just make the characters, I craft the scenario, I apply the skills, and then I make the rolls, and then I let everyone knows what the outcome is based on that. The catch to that is that if characters make the wrong decisions, sometimes they can take damage, be hurt, be debilitated, or maybe even die. It's even possible for the entire party to be wiped. But getting back to the drawing, as you can see here, what I'm doing is I've already done the thumbnail for the image, like I said before, but what I'm doing now is I'm using the thumbnail to craft the general shapes of the trees. I tend to have a pretty funky aesthetic when it comes to drawing. For whatever reason, it seems to be feels very graffiti-esque, I think. But what you're seeing right now is sort of an image of me using those thumbnails, using that thumbnail to craft those trees. And as you can see in the distance, I'm starting to craft the trees in the foreground, as well as illustrating the winding road. Because to get to this area means you have to go through some mountains, and then which are very forested, and then as you get past the mountains, the area beyond is deep forest. So that's what you're seeing right now, just sort of a combination of me inking out the winding roads. I tend to use a Huion tablet when I'm working on projects like this. I don't know who works on a Huion. I mean, I can only imagine it's pretty popular now, considering that they're a lot cheaper than Wacoms. But what I used to do is I used to zoom in super close to a page when I was working on it, which is a little different than the way that I work on it now. I actually keep my distance from the page, interestingly enough, because I find that when I do that, I tend to go through the page a lot faster. I tend to finish it a lot faster with a lot less trouble. So that's pretty good, I think. Now, what you're seeing me do now is working on the detail of some of the rocks as well. I made sure to try to leave most of the stones and stuff like that at the edge of the road, since that's typically what you're going to see. You're not going to see those stones, sort of totally in the middle of the road. That doesn't make sense. They would have found a way to get rid of those, or would have broken those, back then. The comic is high fantasy too. So like obviously it is, since I have elves, but I not only have elves in the world, I have kobolds, which are the same as dragonborn in my world. I have giant kin as well as true giants. There are dragons, but dragons in my world tend to be near omnipotent. But it's definitely a high fantasy world. And I actually as I'm working through this, what I'm doing when I'm working through the illustration is I'm trying to make sure that I'm maintaining the focal point of the image, in the illustration, which in this case is going to be the area in the lower left-hand corner, which is blank right now. I know you see a few pieces of trees there, but that's going to eventually have a carriage put there. So that's going to lead the eye there. So I try not to put too many lines there, which is why those trees look fairly blank there. That's for a few reasons. One, I don't want to create too much visual noise there that I'm just going to sort of overlay with the carriage, and then it's just going to kind of defeat the purpose of that work. I am, however, putting a few pebbles and rocks, as you see on the surface, on the lower left-hand corner there, just to sort of help come across with the point that this is a stony road. It's a road that's traveled, but, this is fairly rugged country. Because if you think about it, elves revere nature, right? So, they're not going to have very well built-in roads. That's just not, in my eyes, that's not going to be characteristic of an elven society, right? And then, with the trees, I sort of make my trees like a lot of other things. I make them kind of funky. I don't know how to describe it. The only way I know to describe it is graffiti-esque, just because, they're sort of twisting and swaying, visually there, which I like that. I feel like that tends to speak to the way that I like to work. And I like the idea of them looking almost like like all the leaves in unison are together like one shape, almost like it's hard to describe. Like sometimes in low poly games in the mid to late 90s, the leaves look like one unified shape, as opposed to acknowledging that they're a collection of shapes. I think that fits in a lot of ways with the way that I work. Now what I'm doing is I'm more refining the middle plane of the image now. As you can see, I'm spending time thinning out the line work. And the reason why is actually for the same reason that I've talked about, that I don't zoom in. I find that when I zoom in, when I'm working on a page, I get overly meticulous, right? And through the process of becoming overly meticulous, what ends up happening is that it just takes longer to finish because I'm so focused on the lines looking perfect. When it just occurred to me a few weeks ago that it was like, hey Charles, the detail that you're sort of focusing on, that's not going to be the viewing distance of the person that's reading the book. So what you're doing is you're taking double the time to work on an illustration, crafting details that the viewer's not even going to see. And this goes even beyond like the sort of stereotypical do a crowd scene in a comic and that the person just looks at it for a moment and then flips it over, which I know tears the heart out of most comic artists because they spend so much time working on it. You'll notice that I'm flipping back and forth between one illustration and this one. And the reason why I'm doing that is that's a panel, the previous actual panel. And that's just to make sure that in terms of visuals, that while I'm trying to deliver the idea that it looks like trees, what I don't want to do is I don't want to overly focus on realistic aesthetics at all, right? Very much. And the reason why is pretty simple. I don't want to start meshing things that are going to clash visually with the image that I'm making, right? Now, you'll notice that I've sort of switched gears here. You'll notice that a lot of the line work now is becoming gray, okay? What I'm doing there is I've duplicated the layer over top, and I've set the opacity of the layer underneath, the original layer, down to 40%. And then on the top layer, what I've done is I've developed a mask, and what I'm doing is I'm coloring over the lines on the top layer with black, and what that does is it makes those lines disappear. And since the duplicate version of the layer is sitting underneath, at 40%, what that does is it creates a ghost-like image of the line work that's underneath, right? Because it's just revealing the illustration that's underneath. And I started doing this, I'm trying to think, I started doing this about 2 years ago. And the reason why was not so simple. I just realized that, my illustrations were very visually busy, right? So what I wanted to do was create more of an emphasis of visual hierarchy in my images, meaning what do you look at first? What do you look at second? What do you look at third, right? Fourth, fifth, sixth, whatever. And I noticed that, when you put in all that detail, that's great. But when you don't break that detail up with space or anything like that, then it does become super busy and it's hard for people to tell what's going on. So what I decided to do instead as an alternative is to gray those interior lines and then break up the illustration into groups, right? In accordance to how close they are to the viewer, right? And the whole point behind that is to just make the illustration a lot more simple to look at and more straightforward, right? Now, what I'm doing here, as you notice, is I've totally grayed out the image now, and I've set it to the side, and now it looks like I'm crafting another object. Now, what I'm doing here is this is going to be the carriage. Most people can tell just based on the general shapes, right? But I'm creating the carriage. So what I like to do is when I'm creating assets that are sort of part of the illustration, but I don't want to create like a separate file, I just grab another layer, set it over top, gray the other image that's at the bottom down, so that way it's less noticeable, and it just gives me an opportunity to use an area on the page that I can use for my own space to make the thing, whatever that thing is. Now, what you're not seeing in the background is that I'm using image reference on what a carriage looks like, because that's not something typically that I draw a lot. This comic is meant to be as efficient as possible. That's the big point, especially when I start talking about the coloring style that I use, which you're gonna see in a little bit. But so I'm a big fan of using image reference, but I'm also a big fan of synthesizing that image reference through, my sort of sense of my sensibilities, right? So what you're seeing there is just me working out what a carriage looks like based on the information that I'm seeing on Pinterest. I have huge Pinterest libraries with images in them that I use, unabashedly, without a care in the world, because I just think it's just going to make for a more grounded image, Also, if there's anyone that's fairly new to illustration or anything like that, if anyone tells you that it's not a good idea to use image reference, I would really file that under don't listen to them. That comes off as someone who probably wants to work in the field, and not throwing any sort of shade or anybody, whatever, but probably someone who doesn't make money from doing this work, right? Not saying that I'm making money right now. It would be nice to, but that's just kind of my observation behind that. I just don't. It's a sort of childlike way of viewing, that work. Okay. Now you can see that I've finished completing the carriage. Now, what you see is me trying to size it to the page so that way it fits visually, and you see me skewing it, so I think that's a good idea. I like to make the image in a vacuum, and then once that's done, especially when it's something that's mechanical like that doesn't really is going to have any human characteristics for me, right, is I will make it in a vacuum, and then I'll skew it and then apply it to the image. Now, I'm also, if you can notice, I'm eliminating a lot of the dark lines in the carriage for the same reason that I did the forest. I'm eliminating a lot of that visual noise, by graying them, so you can still see it, you can still perceive that detail, right? But that's what you have there. Now, you'll notice that the screen is sort of moving about and my mouse is sort of moving to and fro. That's because I'm grabbing more image reference on what carriages look like, just to be on the safe side that I know what I'm doing. Now, what you're seeing is I'm filling creating a layer underneath and filling it with gray. And that's so that way I can change that color to black. I'm sorry, not black, white. So that way I can, excuse me, so that way I can make so that way it can overlap over the image and you don't see the background underneath. So it's a complete illustration. And now I'm just tidying up the outside, which basically means it looks like I'm probably thickening up the line work for the carriage, just so that way it pops out against the trees. That's what you're seeing there. Now soon, what's going to end up happening is I'm going to start flattening the image. You're going to start seeing that fairly quickly. I'm going to bring out the lasso tool and stuff like that. But right now, this looks like I'm grabbing more image reference. That's what that looks like. It doesn't look like I'm cleaning up the image or anything. So, yeah. So, yeah, I definitely am grabbing a bunch of image reference. I use Pinterest a lot. I've got to have like 40 or 50 different boards. And I have a board under Dungeons & Dragons, and then underneath that, it's got nothing but just carriages. And then there's a category under cottages and buildings, I think it was, or cottages and houses. And then the next one is like buildings or something to that effect. So I've got a pretty extensive library when it comes to that. Looks like I'm grabbing more images from the video that I am looking at. So that's good. So very soon it is going to start flattening, and then oh wait, I actually have a few more minutes before that happens. But so yeah, the idea behind it is that I love D&D, I love tabletop, and when 4th Ed came out, even though I was really apprehensive about 4th because 3rd and maybe a little bit of 2nd was all that I knew, I really felt refreshed by 4th's simplicity and how it allowed fighters to really be able to tank. I thought that was super useful. Okay, so now I think I am at the point where I'm flatting. Yes. Okay, so what I do when I flat is I set the illustrations layer to multiply, and then underneath I create a secondary layer. And for that, I just sort of block in the entire panel. And then what I do is I hit the button lock transparency. So that way, anywhere that I color within that area of color doesn't go outside the lines. Okay. Doesn't go outside of the area that I've designated. Then once that happens, what I do is I tend to create another layer over top, and then I set the brush to white, and then I set that secondary layer over top to overlay. But then I don't stop there. I pull down the opacity of that layer to about 60% in most cases. And what that does, in my experience, is because if you try to add white over top of a color, sort of indicative to that is that it will tint the image and it will desaturate the color. Which, if some people are looking for that, that's fine. I want to keep the color, though, fairly saturated. So overlay, when I add it with white and drop the opacity, it allows me to retain a lot of the saturation in the color. So that way, if I decide that I want to use atmospheric perspective or something like that, I can decide to do that over top. But for the main coloring, this is what I do. Now you notice that I created 3 different planes of coloring. Oh yes, now we're at the stage where I'm showing you the different stages after that, where I've blocked in the colors, and then I added a little rim light, right? And now you see how I'm adding some base colors to the carriage and whatnot, and I'm adding rim light to the carriage. Now I'm going to add over an overlay. See that overlay? That immediately makes it very nighttimey, which I really like. It makes it very atmospheric. And then I created another layer over top of that with a soft brush, and I went around the outer edges of the image to darken it further. Now here I'm working on the lanterns, okay? But that is the end of my little cast here. I'm going to be bringing out Catacomb Champions on January the 1st. You guys have a good one.